So yeah, enterprise PKI today, friend or foe? So already got an introduction there, but yeah, I live in Sweden. I'm 39 years old, and usually directory services, Active Directory geek. I like to write blog posts about the internals of Active Directory, the database as mentioned, and the replication APIs and so on. But that's not what we're here today to talk about. Today we're gonna talk about PKI and Active Directory together and how PKI actually can become your enemy and be the way into compromise your Active Directory forest completely. This animation has been with me for several years, and I think it started here with having an enterprise PKI in Active Directory. You have something that's called certificate templates, right? And there is a special dangerous setting that's called supply and request. And if this R certificate template is published on a CA that's trusted in AD, this is very dangerous, because if someone can enroll such a template, you can change the subject to the name of any account and you can become that user. So a lot of things has happened around certificates and Active Directory and PKI. So how many know what strong certificate binding enforcement is or was? Okay, that's good. So strong certificate binding enforcement, why I say was, is that because this has now been enforced through a long period of time, actually 3 years, where we've gone through like audit mode, compatibility mode, and a way to opt out from it. And now finally, last months of Patch Tuesday update actually closed down the register keys for this. So that's not possible anymore. And what this was that you could spoof this. So you could spoof the subject in certain ways, even without enrollment. And we have something new here now also that's called anti-out enforcement. And anti-out enforcement is something that we are in the middle of now. It is enforced by default, also last month's Patch Tuesday, but you can still opt out of it. And that is that every CA that gives out a certificate that is going to be used for authentication against the Active Directory has to be in the anti-out store. So this is what it looked like before we even had the strong binding enforcement, and then the things that are in light blue were actually only the methods of authenticating against AD with certificate that survived after that enforcement. But now when we have anti-auth, the anti-auth requirement, anti-auth is going to be required for all scenarios when you authenticate against Active Directory. And that could be an issue if you are relying on centralized certificate authorities, for example. Every time they update their issuing CAs, you need to add that into anti-auth. You're no longer safe by utilizing only the ALSEC ID attribute and use the mapping method there, like the subject key identifier, for example. And speaking about that is the one of the reasons that there were vulnerability that was considered as a strong mapping, that you could take the subject key identifier because it's supposed to be uneq generated by every CA. But of course, if you create your own CA, you can control that. And if you find a mapping, for example, to a domain admin, and you generate that with the same subject key identifier, then you can become that user that way, and therefore that was no longer a strong mapping. There is another way also how you can do this, and this was something Microsoft created specifically for governments. And this lets you upgrade VP mappings. So if you don't want to have the SID SID extension in the certificate. You don't want to have the SID in the SON attribute. You don't want to use alternate security ID with one of the strong types here. You could actually use something that's called a tuple or a policy tuple or triple mapping. And what that allows you to do is that you can specify the issuer, the certificate issuer by thumbprint, and then you can also have, you need actually to have an OID, an issuance policy, stamped into the leaf certificate, and then you can actually upgrade them by, say, by whitelisting specific UPNs or the issuer subject. So there are various examples about this, how this can be done. And I think I'm going to show a little bit how that can be done. So if we go to domain controller, there is new policy under like administrative template, system, KDC, and you can see I have enabled something that says allow name-based strong mappings for certificates. So what I have here is basically the first the thumbprint of the issuer CA, and then I have the OID that's stamped in the certificate, and then a whitelisted UPN suffix. So if I go back to client, client, and here I have a certificate that is by strong mapping actually demand weak because there's no SID extension in here, so this is the demand weak. If we use a tool that's called Rubius to perform a PKINIT to authenticate with certificate against the KDC, using that certificate, that's actually weak. Fingers crossed. Yeah, so then we get the ticket successfully, even though that certificate is not living up to the standards of the strong mapping, because we have upgraded it using this instead. So yeah, as I said, the register key strong certificate binding enforcement is gone from the KDC SVC DLL by last month's update. It took over 3 years, but one thing that's interesting and that I think is very important to talk about is that the supply and request thing that we saw in the beginning, that you could just enter the name there of like administrator in that forest. So a lot of organizations and people think that, okay, now we have a strong certificate binding enforcement, we're safe. We're completely safe now, because you can't do that anymore. You need to have the SID in there. Somehow you need to supply the SID. And it's, yeah, but if a template has supply in request, you can actually also supply the SID. There is nothing that stops you from supplying the SID and the name. So the important thing is to understand this was never to actually stop that scenario. This was to stop the scenarios listed here. The first one, I think that says it's pretty much everything, that if you were an owner of a computer account, you could change its SPN and its DNS hostname to be the same as a domain controller, and have auto-enrollment just give you a certificate with the subject of a domain controller. And well, if you're the domain controller, you own the forest, right? So these were for spoofing scenarios against getting a certificate for a high privilege user or for domain controllers. It was never designed for that you should have CEAs trusted in your Active Directory forest where you don't have a good security hygiene for issuance of certificates. So it was never designed for that. If you use something that's called authentication mechanism assurance, then you also need to prevent that someone issue a certificate with that OID. So bad certificate template hygiene is not something that strong certificate binding enforcement will help you with. This is something that you need to consider when you design your PKI structure and what kind of CAs you're trusting in AD. So the timeline there, 3 years. If you were into Linda and Cliff's session, you saw their timeline for the domain join hardening thing. So this has taken 3 years. So are we really done with this now? So the red key is gone. So, but if we go back to the client and we are going to run another demo, and we are going to take a certificate that doesn't live up to strong mapping enforcement, and it's not upgraded either. So this is failing. And it should fail because it doesn't live up to strong mapping. So we can go into the domain controller and we should have an event complaining about that, which we have. So it says that, okay, this certificate doesn't prove strong mapping in any way, it doesn't have a SID, it's not in ALSEC ID, this is the certificate thumbprint. So yeah, strong mapping enforcement works. So we're setting some kind of secret key. And we're going back to the client. So we're using exactly the same certificate. We get a ticket. It seems like 3 years is not enough, because when I get through the DL that came out from last patch Tuesday, that key was indeed gone, but I found another key. So there is apparently a key that Microsoft is still handing out to customers that hasn't passed. They still have problems with this. So yeah, we could also look on the domain controller side just to see how it looks now. So now we get this warning event instead, and we can see that, yeah, the certificate thumbprint it's the same certificate, it just passed now. So if you want to find that specific secret key, you can use a tool that's called strings from sysinternals. And if you start to do a string dump of the KDC SVC DLL on this specific offset, you will find that key. So let's have a look at NT-out and what NT-out is. So NT-out is a container in Active Directory where you list all the CAs that should be able to give out certificates that can be used to authenticate against Active Directory. And that is actually by group policy put into the registry of all domain members of that forest. And who validates against this? Well, the KDC PKINIT, so this is used for smart card logon, or if you use YubiKey with PIV, Windows Hello for Business, LDAP Start TLS, MPS through S-channel. Probably some of you had issues when strong binding enforcement came out because you were doing .x with MPS and the computer certificate didn't have the SID in it, for example. So there is also some good features when it comes to to PKI and Active Directory. So authentication mechanism assurance is a really cool feature that actually became available with 2008 R2. And that gives you the opportunity to say that if you authenticate to AD with certificate, I'm gonna give you an extra security group in your token that you can never ever get if you authenticate with password, or you can thinking in a scenario as pass the hash, because they don't prove the certificate to the KDC, they just prove the hash, and then you don't get that additional group membership. And we're actually using this because it's pretty strong, because if you look at an enterprise admin, you tie this up to enterprise admins, if you do any like enumeration of who are your domain admins, who are your enterprise admin, the only thing you're gonna find is the built-in admin account, because they get this group membership dynamically during authentication. So Bloodhound and so on will never find your domain or enterprise admins through group enumeration. But it should be very bad if you don't think about this when you implement your CA. So I'm gonna walk through a scenario. It's not intended that you should read the PowerShell code here. It's all available on my blog, so you can download it and you can test this out by yourself. But the scenario here is that you have a forest, you have a root CA, 2 issuing CAs. Because this is very common. One of the issuing CAs, CA1, is trusted in anti-auth. The other one is not. The other one is managed from tier 1, so it's not managed by domain admin or enterprise admins. It's managed by another PKI team or something like that. So what we're gonna see here is an escalation from that tier 1 CA to tier 0. First, we create our own CA in PowerShell, and we create a certificate underneath that. So that's no problem. But how can we get AD and the domain controllers to trust our own fake CA? Turns out that every CA, enterprise CA, are a member of certificate publishers group, and they have the ability to write into the configuration container and into Active Directory. And if you try to upload a certificate that just has the same distinguished name as an existing root CA, that's gonna work. So how would you do that then? Well, if you're tier 1 admin on that CA, evaluate the system on that, because you're probably just local admin on that CA. Upload your fake CA certificate. And what happens then? Well, after group policy refreshes, that certificate is also going to be distributed to all members in the Active Directory forest, including domain controllers, as a trusted CA. This is not so good. And now there's 3 options that we could leverage this. If it's AMA protected and that leads to enterprise admin, we can just write into any user account's old sec ID with any certificate that has this OID that corresponds to that AMA group, like enterprise admin. Or we can use the subject key identifier if we find an existing tier administrator example that is mapped by them, because we own the CA, we can write an identical subject key identifier. But let's try this then. So when I tried this, it didn't work. And the reason why it didn't work was that I didn't have any certificate revocation list in my certificate. And the KDC demands that you must have that. So how hard can it be to create and sign a CRL? Since it's our fake CA, we have the private keys for that. We can sign a CRL for that, right? So I did that, issued a new certificate, and included the CRL, the CRL distribution point, where I first used a root web server. So you can see 192, 168.11 and CDP fake CA CRL there. And that worked. But what if the DSL limits its outbound traffic? I mean, you should do that in your domain controllers. Your domain controller should not be able to talk to any random web servers. Well, but domain controllers can't block LDAP to themselves, can they? No. So it turns out also that the set publishers group have full control of any sub-container created as a part of every CA installation. So let's use that and upload our CRL there. So I uploaded it to AD, and now I changed the URL to an LDAP URL instead of HTTP to a web server. And that worked. So we're gonna try this. So yeah, we get a ticket, and this certificate is from that fake CA. And now we can try to, for example, add someone to domain admin. And that works. Something that you also could have done was if you found an administrator somewhere, a tier 0 administrator, and it was mapped by alt security identities, altsec ID in this way, because that ski that is in there, I can just issue a certificate with the same ski, and then I will become that user when I authenticate against AD. So So we can see here we have a user that's named Daniel, and if we look here on his alt security identities, you can see there is some mapping here. And what we can do then is, let's see, I just want to prove that this is a certificate from the fake CA. Oops. So we can see that this security identifier in my certificate that I created for my fake CA is the same as the one that's listed in Active Directory for this administrator. So I'm gonna try that. Get the ticket back. And as he was an admin, I'm now him, and I can add someone else to domain admins if I want to. So what I just covered here is that all way leads to mfilth, and that what I just showed, you're actually by default protected from this since last month if you don't opt out and set this allow NT out policy bypass equals 1. And I hope I give you enough reasons for not opting out from this, because everything I showed would be possible then. And it's enforced, this is actually enforced in July, and you can opt out for it. But this will also eventually lead to some problems. If you have external certificate authorities that you must trust, you may are in the government, and you need to trust government CAs, or you may belong to a group of companies that has a central CA. It's now your responsibility to make sure that every time they issue a new or renew their CA certificate, you must actually upload that TNT out in all your forests. So if you have like 20 forests, this becomes a maintained task for you to now be responsible for. And please don't add all CAs to NT out just because it's convenient, because every CA that is actually trusted in NTO can do all the stuff that I showed. So you need to make sure that you know which CAs you trust in NT out, and that you actually trust the administrators and all the process and routines behind those CAs. And then there is a solution for that. I was working on a customer with several forests together with a friend of mine called Sarah Quist. So he wrote a solution for this that's called Anti-Out Guard, where you can actually whitelist your CAs that are intended to be an anti-out, and you can take different countermeasures. So if you find a CA, or if this script or this solution find a CA that shouldn't be there, it could log it to the event log, or it could actually delete it from anti-out because it shouldn't be there. Maybe someone added something by mistake, they needed to test something and just added it there to get something to work. So this is to just as a safety measure to not get anything into anti-out that shouldn't be there. This was a scenario this is actually eliminated now with the new anti-out requirement. So this was basically what we did here was that we issued a certificate from tier 1 or a CA that's not trusted in anti-out. When we issued that certificate, we stamped the OID for an AMA trusted group, and this service desk guy, he could of course like write to any normal user, so he stuck that in there, authenticated as that user with the certificate, but since that OID was there, he became enterprise admin and compromised the forest. This is an ugly one, and this is still possible, unfortunately. There is an attribute that's called MSDS key credential link that is used for Windows Hello for Business, actually, to store self-signed certificates and some other kind of credentials. So here we do the same kind of thing. We have a service desk guy, or maybe a server admin in tier 1. And the only thing you do, if you can request a certificate, if there is a one supplying request template that the server guy has access to, he can, and the forest is AMA protected, he can actually supply that OID. And if he's just can become local admin on any computer in the forest, that's enough, because every computer has this self-write, so they can as themselves write into their own MSDS credential link with this self-ACL. So it only takes that there is one supplying request template, you can be local admin on one PC in the entire forest, you stick the certificate in there, and you authenticate as the computer, and the computer will become an enterprise admin, and you can use the computer and do whatever you want. So more important, so how do you mitigate this? How should you think when you design your certificate structure or hierarchy? The way we have done it is that we still work with enterprise CAs. We have a root CA, but we make sure to always have at least 2 enterprise CAs where one of them is member of NT-out, and that CA can never ever have supply and request templates. But then some people argue and say, well, can't you have this CA certificate manager request, so certificate approval, so you demand approval before the certificate is issued? Yeah, absolutely, you can have that. Maybe works for small shops, but really, should tier 0 enterprise admin, domain admins be sitting on issuing CS and looking through all the attributes and make sure something bad isn't in there? Because you need to look, is there a SID in there that shouldn't be there? Is there a subject in there that shouldn't be there? Is there an issuance policy in there that shouldn't be there? It's not going to work for large scale customers or even smaller customers, in my opinion. So in that CA, which is CA1 in this picture, should never have certificate templates published on them that supply and request. And then you're going to have a issuing CA2. You install it as an enterprise CA, but you untrust it from NT-off. And there you can have supply and request templates. You can do some extra things also. You can, on that CA, disable globally and say that no certificates can ever be issued with the SID extension. So you prevent that as a safety measure. You can also say that on your supply and request templates, if you set them as PKI enrollment flag to a certain number here, then that is also a signal that those certificates can never have the SID contained in them. But there is a caveat here. When you're going to renew issuing CA2, it's going to be automatically added back to NT-auth, and you need to renew it as enterprise admin. So you really need to remove it when you renew that CA certificate every time, unless you run this NT-out guard that is going to snap that up and remove it automatically for you. So to summarize, the strong certificate binding enforcement didn't solve the supply and request thing. It was there to solve something completely else. It was there to solve spoofing in various attributes like the DNS host name, some account name, and UPN for auto enrollment. It was never there to help us with supply and request. So that's the key takeaway here. And NT-out, now all CAs need to be in there, but make sure that only CAs that should be trusted for issuing certificate that can be used to authenticate against Active Directories in there. Not certificates that you don't believe for that, for example, that should only be used to issue certificate to web servers, SSL certificate, or the kind of certificates. They should not be in NT-out. And as I said, all the scripts I've shown here is available on my blog, so you can download them and try them out for yourself. So that's what I had. Thank you for having me.
we have some time for questions. If
Yep.
anyone has questions for Christoffer.
Yeah. Hey, Chris. Thanks for the talk. You mentioned two certificate types, like the SSL certificates and then like user smart card login certificates. But how do you deal with VPN, like always on VPN certificates issued to computers? Like, should that be an NT-auth? Shouldn't that be an NT-auth? Use a third-party radio server instead of Microsoft's network policy services, which actually doesn't need to have that in NT-auth, whereas Microsoft's NDS needs to have that.
Yeah, so that's done a little bit differently, depending on what kind of product you're dealing with. So, for example, MPS wants to have the certificate being in NT-auth. So for devices, I mean, devices is also identities. So when you enroll certificates to devices, absolutely they should be in NT-auth. And maybe I should be more clear about that. You can absolutely still have SSL certificate, device certificates on a CA that's in NT-auth, as long as you build them from Active Directory, as long as you have this setting on the template that says build from Active Directory information. It's only supply and request that is the dangerous thing. So for always on VPN and all these things, those computers probably get their certificate auto-enrolled, and you cannot supply your own content like name or SID in them. So that shouldn't be a problem. But if you have a web server, you maybe need to customize the name. You maybe want to have a web page that's called HR Web internally, and that web server is named something different in Active Directory. It's maybe named SRV1, but you want HR Web. And to be able to get HR Web, you need to get it through a template that has supply and request.
Any more? Anyone? Okay, I think we have our session. Thanks, Christoffer.
Yep, thank you.
Everybody appreciate it.